the morning Mary Pritchard rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882. The dust rose around her wagon wheels like something biblical, and every man on the main street stopped what he was doing to stare at a woman who looked like she had not slept in 3 days, but still sat straighter in that wagon seat than any of them had ever managed in their lives. She was 31 years old, dark-haired, and brown-eyed in the way that made people think of deep creek water and quiet storms. Her dress was black, still in mourning for Thomas Pritchard, who had been dead 6 months to the week, and her hands on the reins were steady even though everything inside her chest felt like a building that had lost its cornerstone. She had $212 sewn into the hem of her petticoat, a deed to 340 acres of good Kansas grassland folded into the breast pocket of her coat, and a letter from a land office attorney in Wichita that had arrived at her sister's house in Missouri 2 weeks prior, informing her, politely and in careful legal language, that her land had been sold. She had not authorized the sale. She had not signed anything. And Thomas had been dead before any sale could have legally occurred. The letter had been signed by one Clarence Whitmore, land agent, Caldwell Territory Office, and it had contained a check for $480, which she had not cashed, and which she had brought with her folded inside the deed as evidence that something had gone profoundly wrong. The town of Caldwell in 1882 was no small frontier settlement. It sat at the end of the Kisham Trail, where thousands of longhorn cattle came through every season, and it carried the energy of a place that had money moving through it and men who wanted to keep that money moving in particular directions. There were saloons and a bank and a proper hotel and a land office and even a small courthouse, and the streets were wide and the noise was constant, and there was always the smell of cattle on the wind even when the herds were still 50 miles south. Mary tied her wagon horse, a solid gray mare named Constance, to the hitching post outside the Caldwell Territorial Land Office, and she went inside. The man behind the counter was young, perhaps 25, with ink on his fingers and a mustache that was trying harder than it was succeeding. He looked up when the little bell above the door rang, and he saw her, and something in his expression shifted in the way that men's expressions shifted when they decided before a word was spoken that they already knew what kind of conversation this was going to be. "Help you, ma'am," he said, in a tone that did not particularly suggest he intended to help her. "My name is Mary Pritchard," she said. "My husband was Thomas Pritchard. He passed in October of last year. I have received a letter from this office informing me that land belonging to our homestead, 340 acres recorded under Pritchard in Sumner County, was sold in January of this year. I did not authorize that sale. I did not sign any documents pertaining to that sale, and I have the deed here showing my name as co-owner alongside my husband's." She placed the deed on the counter and the check on top of it. "I would like to speak with Mr. Clarence Whitmore." The young man looked at the deed without touching it. He looked at the check. He looked at Mary. "Mr. Whitmore is not in at present," he said. "When will he be in?" "Hard to say, ma'am." "Then I will wait." "It may be quite some time." "I drove 4 days from Hannibal, Missouri," Mary said. "I have already waited 6 months. I can wait a while longer." She sat down on the wooden bench along the wall and folded her hands in her lap and waited, and the young clerk with the ink-stained fingers looked at her once more and then looked away and did not speak to her again. Clarence Whitmore did not appear that afternoon. He did not appear the following morning. When Mary returned to the land office for the 3rd time in 2 days, the young clerk told her, with slightly more confidence than before, that Mr. Whitmore had reviewed her inquiry and stood by the legality of the transaction, and that if she wished to dispute the matter, she was welcome to bring it before the County Land Committee, which met the following Tuesday. Mary wrote down the date and the time, and she went back to the rooming house on 2nd Street, where she had taken a small room, and she sat at the narrow desk by the window and wrote out her case by hand, methodically and carefully, citing the deed, citing the date of Thomas's death, citing Kansas homestead law as she understood it from the pamphlet she had gotten from a lawyer in Missouri who had told her, frankly, that she had a reasonable case, but that land disputes in border counties were complicated by local politics, and that she should be prepared for resistance. She had not fully understood what he meant by that until she walked into the county land committee meeting on Tuesday morning. The meeting was held in the back room of the county recorder's office, a low-ceilinged space with 3 long tables arranged in a rough horseshoe and 9 men seated behind them, most of them in their 40s or 50s, most of them wearing the kind of expressions that suggested they had made up their minds before they arrived. At the center of the horseshoe sat Edmund Hale, the county commissioner, a broad-shouldered man of about 55 with thick gray sideburns, and the particular confidence of someone who had been the largest man in every room he had entered for 30 years. Clarence Whitmore was also there, seated to Hale's left, younger than Mary had imagined, perhaps 40, well-dressed in a way that felt deliberate, with pale eyes that moved around the room without ever quite settling on anything. There were perhaps 20 other people in the room, ranchers and landowners and a few townspeople who came to these meetings out of habit or curiosity. They were all men except for Mary. She took a seat near the front, near the side, and she placed her papers on her knee, and she waited for her name to be called. The committee worked through 2 other matters first, a water rights question and a property line dispute between 2 ranchers, and in both cases things moved with the ease of decisions that had already been made in conversations Mary had not been part of. The men at the tables made notes, asked a few questions, and resolved both matters in ways that seemed to satisfy the other parties present, or at least the parties who had friends at the table. Then Edmund Hale said, in a voice like a hand settling heavily on a table, "Next matter. Pritchard versus the Whitmore transaction, claim of unauthorized sale." Mary stood. "Mrs. Pritchard," she said, "Mary Pritchard, the land in question is 340 acres in Section 14, Sumner County, recorded under my name and my late husband Thomas Pritchard's name as co-owners under the 1862 Homestead Act provisions." She could feel the temperature of the room. It was not hostile exactly. It was something worse. It was dismissive. The men at the tables were looking at their papers or at each other or at a point slightly above her left shoulder, and the 2 or 3 who were looking at her directly had the polite, patient expressions of people waiting for a small inconvenience to resolve itself. She pressed on. She laid out her case clearly and in order. She explained the timeline of Thomas's death, October 14, 1881. She explained that she had not been contacted about any potential sale, had not signed any documents, and had not received any legal notice of intention to sell as required under Kansas territorial land law prior to the transfer of co-owned property. She held up the deed. She described the check that had arrived without her solicitation. When she finished, Clarence Whitmore spoke without standing up. "Mr. Hale, Commissioners, the transaction in question was completed in full accordance with legal procedure. Mr. Pritchard signed the preliminary sale agreement in September of 1881, prior to his passing. Upon his death, with no minor heirs and the property being in debt, the agreement was honored as a contractual obligation. Mrs. Pritchard was duly notified by post. The notification arrived after the sale was completed," Mary said immediately. "The letter I received was dated the 22nd of January. The sale, according to the documents attached, occurred on the 15th. A mailing delay, Mrs. Pritchard, not a procedural error. And the property was not in debt," Mary said, and she could hear her voice getting slightly tighter, not angry but precise, the way a person gets when they are fighting to be heard. "We had one outstanding note on equipment, a plow and a harrow totaling $42, which was settled by my husband in August. I have a receipt." She held it up. Nobody at the table reached for it. "The preliminary agreement," Whitmore continued, still addressing Hale, still not looking at Mary, "was signed by the property owner, Mrs. Pritchard's signature was not required under the terms of the agreement, as the agreement predated Mr. Pritchard's passing and constituted a contractual obligation binding on the estate. "I was co-owner," Mary said. "My name is on the deed. Co-owner, not a party to an estate. A co-owner, the deed is right here." Hale looked at her. His expression was not unkind. It was something slightly more offensive than unkind. It was gentle. "Mrs. Pritchard," he said, "we understand this is a difficult situation, and we appreciate you bringing your concerns before the committee. Mr. Whitmore will be asked to review the documentation and provide the committee with a full accounting of the transaction." "Respect, Mr. Hale, that is what he told me at the land office 4 days ago. I need a ruling, not a review. These things take time, ma'am. 340 acres is my livelihood. I have a son in Missouri with my sister right now because I could not bring a 6-year-old boy across 4 days of open road for a meeting. I need to know whether my land has been legally taken from me or not, and if it is not, I need it returned. I would like a ruling." There was a silence in the room. It was the kind of silence that is not respectful but merely waiting for the woman to finish so that things can return to their normal shape. "We will take it under advisement," Hale said. And that was when, from somewhere in the middle of the room behind her, a chair scraped back on the wooden floor, and a voice said, quietly but in a tone that somehow carried to every corner of the space without effort, "Commissioner Hale." The room went quiet, not the polite quiet of procedure, the deep quiet of genuine attention. The kind of quiet that happens when a certain kind of man speaks and everyone present, regardless of whether they like him or agree with him, pays attention because something in the timbre and weight of the voice tells them that not paying attention would be a mistake. Mary turned. He was standing near the back of the room. He was tall, perhaps 3 or 4 inches over 6 feet, with the kind of build that came from actual work rather than deliberate effort, broad through the shoulder and lean everywhere else. He wore dark trousers and a plain flannel shirt and a vest that had seen better days, and his hat, a well-worn brown felt hat with a straight brim, was in his hand rather than on his head, which in that room in that moment was a small gesture of seriousness that several of the seated men seemed to register. He had dark brown hair and a jaw that looked like it had been cut with deliberate intention, and his eyes, gray-green in the morning light from the side window, were fixed on Edmund Hale with an expression that was entirely calm and entirely serious. He was, Mary would later calculate, somewhere in his mid-30s. "Mr. Maddox," Hale said, and his tone was notably different than it had been when he had been addressing Mary. Not deferential, exactly, but watchful. "I've heard Mrs. Pritchard's argument," the man said, and his name settled in Mary's mind like something dropped into still water. "Frederick Maddox. I've heard Mr. Whitmore's response. And with respect to this committee, I think the co-ownership question being raised is material, and it isn't being treated as material, and I'd like to say why. Nobody told him to sit down. Nobody told him the committee would take it under advisement or that these things took time. He spoke for perhaps 4 minutes. He was not a lawyer. That much was clear from his plain language. But he knew land law the way a man knows it when he has lived by it and fought for it, and read every document pertaining to it, with the kind of attention that comes from having things at stake. He cited the specific provision of Kansas land statute that governed co-owned property transactions, which he appeared to have memorized rather than read from notes. He pointed out that a preliminary agreement signed by one co-owner did not constitute a binding contractual obligation on the property itself, when the other co-owner had not been party to the negotiation, had not signed any document, and had not been given the legally required notice of intention to transfer. He said that if the committee ruled otherwise, they were effectively establishing a precedent that any co-owner in Sumner County could dispose of jointly held land without the other co-owner's knowledge or consent, which would create legal chaos in every shared homestead property in the county. He sat down. The room was still quiet for a moment after he finished, the way a room is quiet when something true has been said plainly, and there is no immediate counter available. Edmund Hale looked at Clarence Whitmore. Whitmore's pale eyes were still and flat. "Mr. Whitmore," Hale said slowly, "I think the committee will need to see the full documentation on this transaction before any ruling is entered. That means the original sale agreement with signatures, the notification correspondence, and all recordings. We'll reconvene on Thursday." It was not a victory, but it was not a dismissal, and Mary had walked in expecting a dismissal. She gathered her papers and stood and turned, and the man named Frederick Maddox was already making his way toward the door at the back of the room, pulling his hat back on as he went. He was nearly out before she caught up with him in the narrow hallway beyond, and when she said, "Excuse me, sir," he stopped and turned and looked at her, and she saw up close that his eyes were indeed gray-green, and that there was something in them that was careful and kind and slightly wary all at once. The eyes of a man who had been in enough difficult situations to have learned caution but had not yet learned indifference. "Mrs. Pritchard," he said. "You know who I am," she said. "I read the notice when it was filed. My name is Frederick Maddox. I have property adjoining the Pritchard tract to the north." Mary blinked. "You are my neighbor. Your land neighbors mine, yes, ma'am. About a quarter-mile of fence line between us." He paused. "And I knew Thomas, not well but well enough. He was a fair man." There was something in the way he said it that made Mary's throat tighten briefly. Thomas had been a fair man. He had also been stubborn and sometimes closed off and had not told her everything he should have, including, apparently, whatever conversation he had with Clarence Whitmore in September. But he had been fair, and hearing a near stranger say it plainly made the grief spike sudden and sharp the way it did sometimes, still, 6 months in. "Thank you for speaking up in there," she said. "I could not get a word through to them." "They heard you fine," Frederick Maddox said, his voice even. "They were just hoping if they waited long enough you'd go away." "I have no intention of going away." "No," he said, and for the first time something shifted very slightly in his expression, not quite a smile but in that direction. "I don't imagine you do." He put his hat back on fully and gave her a slight nod. "Thursday's meeting. Be there early before Whitmore has time to prime the room, and bring 2 copies of everything. They'll try to delay by saying they need more time to review documents. If you have 2 copies, you can hand one across the table and keep one yourself." Then he walked out into the bright Kansas morning, and Mary stood in the hallway for a moment holding her papers and thinking that whatever she had expected to find in Caldwell, Kansas, it had not been that. She went back to the rooming house and she sat at the narrow desk and she made a second copy of every document by hand: the deed, the receipt for the equipment debt payment, the unsigned check, the letter from the land office, her own written account of the timeline, and she finished well past midnight with aching fingers and a clear head. She thought about Frederick Maddox while she wrote. She thought about the way the room had changed when he stood up. She thought about a man who had read a land filing notice about a neighbor's property dispute and had cared enough about it to show up at a county committee meeting and speak, without being asked, without any apparent benefit to himself, because the argument being made was wrong and he knew the law well enough to say why. She thought these things and then she put them away, because she was a widow with a 6-year-old son in Missouri and a land dispute to win, and she did not have the particular luxury of thinking too long about any man, no matter how gray-green his eyes were or how carefully he had turned a room around with 4 minutes of plain speaking. On Wednesday morning, she went to the county recorder's office and asked to review the public recording on the Pritchard property transaction, and the recorder, a small man named Peters who seemed genuinely nervous about the whole situation, showed her the file after only a brief hesitation. What she found in that file was troubling. The preliminary sale agreement that Whitmore had referenced did have Thomas's signature on it, dated September the 3rd, 1881. Thomas had died October the 14th, so he had signed something 6 weeks before his death, but the agreement was for a significantly lower price than the $480 check she had received. It was for $310. The difference, $170, was unaccounted for in any document in the file. More importantly, the buyer recorded on the transaction was not a ranching company or a land development concern as she had assumed. The buyer was listed as Hale Property Holdings, a name that made something cold settle in Mary's chest, because Edmund Hale was the county commissioner, and Edmund Hale was the man who had just told her the committee would take her case under advisement. She wrote everything down. She wrote down the page numbers and the recording dates and the exact wording of each document, and she asked Peters if she could purchase copies, and he said slowly that he wasn't sure he could authorize that without the commissioner's approval, and she said very quietly that public records were public, and Peters looked at the floor for a moment, and then said he would need to check with his supervisor. She left and went directly to the dry goods store down the street and purchased 2 more blank notebooks and a fresh bottle of ink. And she went back to the rooming house and wrote everything she had memorized from the file while it was still exactly clear in her mind. That afternoon, walking back from the post office where she had written a letter to her sister explaining she would be in Caldwell longer than expected and asking that her son Daniel remain there a while more, she passed the livery stable on the south end of the main street, and Frederick Maddox was there, just coming out, leading a big bay horse with a working bridle and the air of a man who had been up since before dawn. He saw her. He stopped. "Mrs. Pritchard." "Mr. Maddox." "I went to the recorder's office this morning." Something changed in his expression. He tied the bay to the post and turned toward her more fully. And she told him what she had found. The discrepancy in price. The buyer's name. His jaw tightened. "Hale Property Holdings," he said, not as a question. "You know it." "I know the name. There have been other transactions in the county through that holding. I didn't know Hale's name was on it directly." He was quiet a moment. "That changes things. A commissioner sitting as judge on a dispute over land he's already purchased through a holding company is a conflict of interest that would not survive scrutiny in any proper court." "It isn't a proper court," Mary said. "It's a county committee. In this county, the committee is the first step. If the committee rules against you, a court challenge gets expensive and slow, and most people give up before it gets that far." He looked at her steadily. "Which is the strategy? I don't have the money for a long court battle." "I know." He was quiet a moment. "I know a man in Wichita. He's an attorney who handles land cases, particularly cases involving irregular transfers and conflicts of interest. He's argued before the Kansas Supreme Court. If we can document the conflict of interest with the Hale name on the purchase, there is a very real possibility this doesn't need to go to a full trial. A well-written letter from a qualified attorney to the right parties in Topeka could end this faster than a court case." Mary studied him. "Why are you helping me?" He did not look away from the question. He met it directly. The way she was coming to understand was simply his manner. "Because it's wrong," he said. "Because Thomas Pritchard was a decent man and he was ill and someone took advantage of that. Because you came 4 days on the road by yourself to fight for what's yours, and everyone in that room this morning was hoping you'd be too tired or too uncertain to know what you had." A brief pause. "And because if they can do it to the Pritchard property, they can do it to mine." It was honest. She appreciated that he included the practical reason alongside the principled one. Honesty without performance. "What would I need to provide to this attorney?" she asked. "Everything you have, in writing, organized by date. If you can get it copied before Thursday, I'll send it to him with a letter of my own regarding the Hale Holdings connection and the conflict of interest. With any luck, we hear something before the end of the week." "I've already been copying everything," she said. "I was up until past midnight." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his expression again, that slight shift she had seen in the hallway of the recorder's office. Not quite a smile, but present and genuine. "Thursday morning," he said, 8 o'clock before the meeting, outside the recorder's office. Bring everything." He untied the bay, swung up into the saddle with the easy motion of a man who had been doing it since he was a child, and rode south down the main street, and Mary watched him go for a moment longer than was strictly necessary before turning back toward the rooming house. She spent all of Wednesday evening organizing her documentation into the clearest possible order, chronological and cross-referenced, and she wrote a formal summary at the beginning of the assembled packet that laid out the key facts in 12 numbered points. She worked by lamplight until the lamp oil ran low, and then by the last of the evening light from the window. And when she finally set down her pen, her hand was cramped, but her mind was ordered and calm. At breakfast on Thursday morning, she sat alone in the rooming house dining room and ate biscuits and gravy and drank black coffee, and the other boarders, 2 cattle drovers and a traveling goods salesman, paid her no particular attention, which suited her entirely. At 8 o'clock, she was outside the recorder's office with her papers in the leather satchel Thomas had bought for her in their second year on the homestead, when she had started keeping the farm accounts. It was good leather, still solid, and she held it against her side and watched the street wake up around her. Frederick Maddox came from the direction of the livery at 8:02, on foot this time, carrying a flat leather document case of his own under his arm. He was dressed in clean clothes, dark wool trousers and a white shirt and a dark coat, and he had shaved since the previous afternoon. The coat was not new, but it fit well across those shoulders, and he wore it with the matter-of-fact ease of a man not attempting to impress anyone but who had dressed for the gravity of the occasion. "Morning," he said. "Good morning." They stood together in the early sunlight and went through her documents. He read her summary and looked up and said, "This is very well organized." "I kept the farm accounts for 8 years," she said. "It shows." He made one suggestion, that she add a note specifically about the recording date of the sale versus the date of the notification letter, to make the sequence absolutely explicit. She wrote it in the margin in her neat hand, and he watched her write it and said nothing but nodded when she was done. He had written a 3-page letter to the attorney in Wichita, and he showed it to her. It was precise and factual, and cited the relevant statutes by number, and it named Edmund Hale and Hale Property Holdings directly, and laid out the conflict of interest in terms that could not be construed as unclear. "You know the law well," she said. "I've had reason to learn it," he said. He did not elaborate immediately, but after a moment, as they walked toward the committee meeting, he said, "I had a property dispute myself 4 years ago. Someone tried to file on a section of my land under a fraudulent survey. I spent nearly a year fighting it. By the end of it, I knew more about Kansas land statutes than most of the attorneys I dealt with." "Did you win?" "Eventually," he said. The Thursday committee meeting was different from Tuesdays in the way that meetings are different when the people running them know someone in the room has information they were not expecting to be available. Edmund Hale was still at the center of the horseshoe table, still broad and gray sideburned, but there was a quality to his stillness that felt less like authority and more like waiting. Clarence Whitmore was there again. He had brought a folder of documents considerably thicker than his previous materials. Mary sat down near the front. Frederick Maddox sat 2 rows behind her, which she thought for a moment was strange, but then she understood it. If she needed to speak, he was behind her. If she needed support, it was there, but this was her case to present. Hale called her name and she stood. This time she moved through her presentation with the precision of the summary she had written, 12 numbered points, each supported by a specific document. When she reached point 7, the discrepancy between the agreed sale price and the payment amount, she read the recording page number aloud and put her copy of the relevant page on the table in front of the committee. And when she reached point 10, she named Hale Property Holdings as the buyer of record. There was a different kind of silence this time. Edmund Hale's face did not change expression. Several of the other committee members looked at him and then looked away. Whitmore's pale eyes shifted. "Mrs. Pritchard," Hale said, and his voice had lost the gentle quality. "The recorded buyer is a private holding company and has no direct bearing on Commissioner Hale," Frederick Maddox said from his row, quietly and without standing this time, because he did not need to stand for the room to pay attention. "With respect, The committee should be aware that I have already sent documentation of this conflict of interest to an attorney in Wichita with experience in Kansas Supreme Court land cases. He should have it by tomorrow morning. Whitmore's folder shifted on the table in front of him. The silence that followed lasted a full 10 seconds, which in a room like that room was a very long time. One of the other committee members, an older man with a white beard named Cecil Doran, whom Mary did not know, cleared his throat and said, "Ed, I think we need to discuss this matter in private before we proceed." Hale looked at Doran, looked at Mary, looked at Whitmore, looked at Frederick Maddox. "The committee will recess for 30 minutes, he said. They went into the side room and closed the door, and Mary sat in the near-empty main room with Frederick Maddox beside her now, both of them quiet, waiting. "You named him directly," Frederick said low. "Yes." "Good." They did not speak much in those 30 minutes. At one point Mary asked if he wanted coffee, and he said he was fine. And at another point he asked if she had eaten that morning, and she said yes. And these small exchanges, ordinary and considerate, sat comfortably between them in the silence. When the committee came back, Hale's expression was different. Still controlled, still authoritative, but underneath it something had shifted the way a foundation shifts when the ground beneath it moves. He read a prepared statement, which clearly had been written in that 30-minute recess in some haste. The committee had reviewed Mrs. Pritchard's documentation and found material questions regarding the completion of notification requirements prior to the finalization of the Pritchard property transaction. Pending full review of all records, the transaction was to be considered suspended, and the recorded deed was to be restored to its prior status, showing Mary Pritchard as co-owner, until the questions were resolved. The matter was to be referred to the State Land Office in Topeka for independent review. He did not address the conflict of interest directly. He did not acknowledge Hale property holdings, but the transaction was suspended and the deed was restored, and that was what mattered most immediately. Mary sat very still for a moment after Hale finished reading. She thought about Thomas. She thought about Daniel in Missouri at his aunt's house, not understanding entirely why his mother had driven away on a wagon for so long. She thought about the land, the grassland in Sumner County, the way it looked in the early morning with the dew still on it and the meadowlarks calling across the long, flat distance. She had it back. Not permanently, not yet, not until Topeka made its independent ruling, but she had it back. She gathered her papers and stood and walked out of the room into the hallway and then out into the morning air, and she stood on the step and breathed, and a moment later the door opened behind her and Frederick Maddox came out and stood beside her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Frederick said, "Topeka will rule in your favor. Once an independent reviewer sees the conflict of interest, there's no legal basis to uphold the transaction." "You sound certain." "I am certain." He was quiet. "It may take 2 or 3 months, but it will come through." She turned and looked at him. In the full morning light, out of the low-ceilinged interior of that room, he looked slightly different, less formal, more human. There was a tiredness around his eyes that she had not noticed before, the tiredness of someone who had been up early and was carrying something, not just her problem, but something of his own. "Mr. Maddox," she said, "I don't know how to thank you adequately." "You did the work," he said. "You organized the case. You named the conflict of interest in front of the committee. All I did was speak when the room needed someone to speak. You did considerably more than that, and you know it." He looked at her. The gray-green eyes were direct. "Have breakfast with me," he said. "There's a decent place on 2nd Street, and I have a proposal I'd like to discuss with you regarding the property in Sumner County." It was so practical and so sudden and delivered with such complete straightforwardness that she almost smiled. Almost. "A proposal," she said. "About the land," he said immediately, and there was something in the slight quickness of his clarification that made the almost smile a little more defined. "A business proposition. About your land and how to keep it generating income while the Topeka review proceeds, so you're not losing the season." "All right," she said. "Breakfast." They went to the place on 2nd Street, which was clean and warm and smelled of coffee and frying pork, and they sat across from each other at a table by the window. The breakfast was eggs and biscuits and good coffee, and outside the window the street was fully active now, horses and wagons and men on foot going about the business of a busy frontier town. The proposal was this. Frederick Maddox had cattle, roughly 120 head that he rotated across his sections, and with the long dry spell the previous summer he was short on grazing, and had been supplementing with purchased feed at considerable expense. The Pritchard tract, with the deed now restored and the transaction suspended, was legally Mary's land to manage. If she was willing, he would graze his cattle on the eastern section of her property through the spring and summer, paying her a fair grazing rate per head per month, which would provide her with consistent income while she waited for the Topeka ruling, and while she figured out what she intended to do with the land long-term. He laid this out in clear terms and with numbers already calculated, and she listened to every word of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "What's the going rate for grazing in this county?" he told her. "You offered me above the going rate." Did not flinch. "Your land is good grass, good water access from the creek on the south end. It's worth above the going rate. You're being generous." "I'm being accurate," he said. "I've been watching that land for 3 years. Your husband kept it well. The grass management is better than most operations around here." She thought about it. It was a practical solution and a fair one, and it would keep the land in active use rather than sitting idle through the season, and it would provide real income. "I accept," she said. "Draw up an agreement." He said he would have it ready by the following morning. They finished breakfast. The coffee was good and the food was good, and the conversation moved, after the business was settled, into things slightly less formal. He told her he had been on his land in Sumner County for 6 years, had come from Ohio originally, had built the operation from a single section, and had bought adjacent land as he could afford it. He had never married, though he said this last part in a tone that was matter-of-fact rather than apologetic. She told him about Daniel, who was 6 years old and extremely interested in horses, and would very likely have a long argument with any schoolteacher who tried to keep him indoors. Frederick Maddox listened to this with what appeared to be genuine attention, and said that 6-year-olds with opinions about horses generally made better ranchers than people who had gone to school to become ranchers, and Mary laughed, which surprised her. It came out warm and real before she could manage it. He looked at her when she laughed, not in the way men sometimes look at women who laugh at their observations, pleased with themselves, just attentive, as though the sound was something worth noting. She stopped laughing and felt, briefly, self-conscious and looked out the window. "How long will you stay in Caldwell?" he asked. "I need to get back to Daniel," she said. "He's with my sister in Missouri and she has 3 of her own. I can't impose much longer." She paused. "I thought I'd go back to Missouri and wait for the Topeka ruling. It could be months." "It could be," he said. "Though if you wanted to see the property before you go, I could show you. I've been looking after it somewhat, keeping an eye on the fence lines and the water in Thomas's absence." A pause. "Informally. Without authorization, I realize, but I didn't want the property to fall into disrepair." She looked at him. There was something very still about how he said it, quiet, as though he was not quite sure whether she would appreciate it or resent it, and had done it anyway because it was the right thing. "I would like to see it," she said. "I haven't been there since before Thomas got sick." "Tomorrow morning, then, if you're willing to ride." "I can ride," she said. They rode out the following morning on a clear spring day that smelled of cut grass and turned earth, with the sky above the Kansas plains so blue it seemed unreal, the particular blue of early May when the winter has finally let go of the ground, and everything is growing with the hurried determination of things that know the summer heat is coming. Mary rode Constance and Frederick rode the bay, whose name she learned was Abbott, and they went south and then east on the road out of Caldwell, and the land opened up around them in the way that Kansas land does, wide and then wider still. the horizon so far out it seemed like the earth itself was breathing. She had not been on this land in 10 months. Since the previous summer, when Thomas had first gotten sick and they had decided she should take Daniel to her sister's while Thomas saw the doctor in Wichita. She had not known then that she was seeing the land for the last time with Thomas alive. When they came through the gate in the fence line that marked the northern boundary of the Pritchard property, she pulled Constance to a stop and just looked. The grass was up, thick and green from the spring rains, moving in long, slow waves in the breeze like something breathing. The fence lines were intact, recently mended in a few places where they had needed it. She could see the newer wire. The creek that ran along the southern edge was running clear and full. The small house, a solid timber frame structure she and Thomas had built in their 3rd year, was still standing, its window shutters closed against the winter just past, its roof sound. "The shutters," she said. "I had them closed before the winter set in," Frederick said from beside her. "And I replaced 2 sections of fence on the north side in November. There was some wind damage. I have the materials receipts if you want reimbursement." "I'll add it to the grazing agreement," she said, without looking away from the house. She sat there for a moment longer. The grief was present but not overwhelming. It was the grief of love and time and things that cannot be undone, and it was hers and she held it. "Thank you," she said, "for looking after it." He said nothing. But he waited, the way a person waits when they understand that someone needs a moment, without filling the space or making it smaller with words. They rode the full property that morning. All 340 acres, the eastern sections with the deep grass that would make excellent grazing, the rise in the center section where you could see for miles on a clear day, the southern stretch along the creek. He knew the land almost as well as she did, perhaps better in some details, having walked the fence lines several times. He pointed out where the soil was richest, where there was a natural drainage channel that would need watching in heavy rain, where there was a stand of cottonwood trees along the creek that was young but healthy and would provide good shade for cattle in summer. She listened to everything and asked questions, and he answered them directly and without condescension, which she noted because she had encountered a great deal of condescension in the previous week. At the high point of the center section, where the view opened up to the south and east, they stopped and let the horses graze, and Frederick pulled out a wrapped bundle from his saddlebag that turned out to contain 2 thick sandwiches and a canteen of water and 2 apples, which he had apparently packed that morning without mentioning it. And they sat on the grass and ate. And the wind was warm, and the meadowlarks were calling, and Mary thought that whatever else was uncertain. This land was worth everything she was doing to keep it. "Do you like it here?" she asked him, not about the land, about Kansas, about this place. He thought about it. She liked that he thought about it before answering. "Yes," he said, "I like the space. I like that you can see trouble coming from a distance," a pause. "I like that there's always more work than you can do, so there's no room to waste time." "Is that what you were running from, wasted time?" He looked at her, a slight surprise, as though he had not expected a question that cut in that direction. "Ohio," he said after a moment. "A family expectation of a particular kind of life." Smaller than what I needed, he looked out at the plains. "Not a dramatic story. Most real ones aren't," she said. They were quiet a moment, and the quiet was entirely easy, the way quiet is between people who are discovering that they fit together in that particular way. "You're going to come back," he said. Not a question, an observation. "Yes," she said. "This is my land. Daniel will grow up here." "Good," he said, and that was all, but the word had a quality to it that she sat with on the ride back to Caldwell, turning it over like something she had found in the grass and was not entirely sure yet what it was. She left Caldwell 2 days later, once the grazing agreement was signed and witnessed and filed with the recorder, and once she had confirmed with the county recorder that her deed was properly restored in the public record, and once she had written a full account of everything to send to the Wichita attorney alongside Frederick's documentation. Frederick walked her to the wagon on the morning she left. He helped her check the harness on Constance in a practical, matter-of-fact way that was not about demonstrating usefulness, but simply about making sure the hardware was right. He handed up her satchel. He stood back. "The Topeka office is efficient," he said. "You'll hear in 6 to 8 weeks, I'd estimate. And if I need to come back before then you come back," he said simply. "I'll be here." She looked down at him from the wagon seat. He was looking up at her, hat in hand again, the way he had held it in the committee room, that gesture of seriousness. And in the morning light with the Kansas plains behind him and the town waking up around them, he looked very solid and very present and very much like someone who meant what he said. "Goodbye, Mr. Maddox," she said. "Goodbye, Mrs. Pritchard," he said. "Safe travel." She drove out of Caldwell and did not look back, which was a deliberate act, because she knew that if she did she would think too long about gray-green eyes and a voice that could quiet a room. The weeks in Missouri were good and difficult in equal measure. Good because Daniel was there, and Daniel at 6 years old was a source of joy so specific and constant that it was impossible to feel entirely bereft when he was nearby. He was dark-haired like her, and had Thomas's wide forehead and a laugh that made grown adults laugh in response, whether they intended to or not. He had questions about everything and a particular reverence for horses, and had, during her absence, apparently convinced her sister's eldest, who was 9, that they should build a proper barn for the 3 backyard chickens. Difficult because the waiting was hard, because Missouri felt small and closed in a way it had not felt before she went to Kansas, as though she had opened a door and now the room behind her was not sufficient anymore. Because at night sometimes she lay awake and thought about the land and about what came next, and occasionally, honestly, about Frederick Maddox, about the way he had spoken in that room, and the way he had packed sandwiches for a ride he had proposed the previous morning, and the way he had said, "Then you come back," as though it were the simplest and most obvious thing in the world. She wrote him a letter. A proper one, not entirely about the land matter, though she framed it that way initially, asking about the grazing and the condition of the property. She asked whether the south fence had held through a rainstorm her sister had mentioned, which had apparently been significant across the Kansas border. She asked how Abbott was. His response came in 11 days, which given the mail routes was fast. He had written 3 pages in a hand that was clear and more literate than she had expected, though she was not sure why she had not expected it. The south fence had held. The cattle were grazing the eastern sections well, and the grass management was proving excellent. The land was as good as he had said it was. Abbott was fine. And then at the end of the 3rd page, after all the practical information, he had written, "The mornings here are loud with meadowlarks this time of year. I think you would find it satisfactory." She read that line 3 times. It was not a love letter. It was not anything she could point to and call a declaration. But it was the line of a man who had thought about the fact that she was not there to hear the meadowlarks, and who had thought it enough to write it down. She wrote back. She told him Daniel had decided that the word lasso was the best word in the English language, and had been using it as an adjective. She asked more questions about the property. And at the end she wrote, "The mornings here are very full of my sister's children, which is its own kind of loud. I find myself thinking about space more often than I used to." The letter exchange continued across the weeks, arriving roughly every 10 days on each side, and with each letter the practical land matters took up slightly less of the page and other things took up slightly more. Frederick wrote about the history of his land, how he had come to it, the 2 hard winters before he had established enough of a cattle operation to feel secure. He wrote about his neighbors, a family named the Warrens who had 3 daughters and the best kitchen garden in the county, and who had been Thomas Pritchard's nearest friends. He wrote once, briefly, about Ohio, about his father's hardware business and the particular smallness of the life that had been planned for him and the particular clarity of the moment he had decided not to live it. Mary wrote about Thomas. Not much, but honestly. She wrote that he had been a good man and a good father, and that she had loved him in the way you love someone you build something with, steadily, and with full knowledge of their flaws and yours. She wrote that the grief was not a wound anymore but a weight, and that she was learning to carry the weight rather than set it down, because some weights are right to carry. Frederick wrote back about that letter and said simply, "I think that is the right understanding of it. I am sorry for your loss, and I am glad for the kind of woman it seems you are." She sat with that one for a while too. The ruling from Topeka came 7 weeks after she left Caldwell. It came in a long official envelope with the seal of the Kansas State Land Office, and it was in formal language that took 3 pages to say what it took 1 sentence to understand. The Pritchard property transaction had been found invalid due to procedural irregularities and a documented conflict of interest on the part of the reviewing commissioner. The deed was fully restored in Mary Pritchard's name alone as surviving owner, and the matter was closed. The $480 check she had kept without cashing was hers by right of the settlement. The buyer, Hale Property Holdings, was entitled to no refund, as the transaction had been ruled fraudulent, and the State Land Office was referring the matter to the Attorney General's office for further investigation of Clarence Whitmore's handling of property transfers in Sumner County. Mary sat at the table in her sister's kitchen and read it twice and then put it down and said nothing for a moment, and her sister, a warm and sensible woman named Ruth, came in from the back porch and saw her face and said, "Well, I won," Mary said. Ruth sat down and took her hand, and they sat together for a moment, and Daniel came running in from somewhere and asked what was happening, and Mary said, "We're going home, baby," and Daniel said, "To the farm." And she said yes, and Daniel made a sound of such pure and uncomplicated joy that the kitchen felt briefly lit from the inside. She wrote to Frederick that night. It was the longest letter she had written him, and it covered the ruling and what it meant, and the plans she was now able to make for the property. And it covered Daniel's reaction and her sister Ruth, and the strange feeling of relief that was also slightly terrifying, because now there was nothing preventing her from going back. Now the path was open, and she had to choose to walk down it. And that was a different kind of thing than fighting to keep it open. And at the end of the letter, longer than the paragraph about Topeka, and longer than the paragraph about Daniel and the meadowlarks and the smell of the Kansas morning she could still remember from standing on her own land, she wrote, "I think I want to be honest with you, Mr. Maddox, because you have been honest with me from the first moment, and it seems wrong to be anything less than that in return. I think about our conversations more than I think about most things. I think about the breakfast in Caldwell and the ride across my land and the letters you have written, which are better letters than most people write, and which I have read several times each. I do not know what to make of this entirely, and I am a practical woman and a widow, and I have a child to raise, but I wanted you to know it, because it seems important to say true things to people when you have the chance." She folded the letter and sealed it and posted it before she could talk herself out of it. His response came in 9 days. She was in the kitchen helping Ruth with the bread when it arrived, and she took it out onto the back porch to read it alone. He had written 6 pages, his longest letter. He had written about the land and the cattle and the warrens and the meadowlarks. He had written about the grazing agreement and the status of the property. And then, on the 4th page, he had written, "I am going to be honest in return, Mrs. Pritchard, because it is my habit and because you have asked for it. I have thought about your letters considerably more than is strictly accounted for by the land business they pertain to. I have thought about the morning we rode your land, and about the way you sat very still looking at your house, and held whatever it was you needed to hold without asking me to carry any part of it, which I found to be one of the bravest things I have seen. I have thought about you laughing at breakfast and about the 12 numbered points in your legal summary, and about the fact that you came 4 days on a wagon by yourself for what was right and that you were right. I am not given to saying things I am not sure of, but I am fairly sure of this. I would like very much for you to come back to Kansas, Mrs. Pritchard. Not only to your land, though your land is waiting for you and it is in good order. But to this county, to this part of the world. I find that I think about you being nearby, and I find that I would like you to be nearby, which I recognize is a great deal to say in a letter when we have had one breakfast together and one morning ride. But you said it seemed important to say true things, and this is a true thing. Mary read it twice on the back porch. The sun was warm on her face, and her sister's chickens were making their comfortable small noises in the yard, and somewhere down the street Daniel was shouting instructions to someone about something. And she sat with the letter and felt something open in her chest that had been closed for a long time. She went inside and told Ruth she would be leaving for Kansas in 2 weeks, once she had made arrangements and packed properly and gotten Daniel ready for the trip and sold 2 pieces of furniture that she did not need to haul across the road. And Ruth looked at her face and looked at the letter in her hand and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "He sounds like a good man." "I think he is," Mary said. "Then go," Ruth said. They made the trip in late June of 1882. Mary and Daniel and 3 trunks, and a crate of books and Daniel's collection of stones. He had been gathering from the Missouri riverbank for the past 2 years. The journey took 4.5 days because they stopped properly each night, and Mary did not push Constance too hard in the summer heat. Daniel talked almost continuously for the entire journey in the way that 6-year-olds do when they are excited, and Mary listened to approximately 60% of it and let the rest wash over her like water. And at night she sat by the small fire she made at the camp they set along the road and looked up at the enormous Kansas sky and felt, for the first time in a long time, that she was moving towards something rather than away from it. Frederick met them at the gate of the Pritchard property, not in Caldwell because she had written ahead and said she was going directly to the land. He was there on Abbott with a 3rd horse beside him, a steady-looking roan, and he looked exactly as she remembered him, tall and direct and present, but when she came through the gate in the wagon and he rode up beside her, she thought he looked slightly less wary than before, as though something had eased. "Mrs. Pritchard," he said. "Mr. Maddox," she said, and she was aware that her voice was slightly warmer than it might have been had she not been carrying his 6 pages of honesty in her coat pocket. Daniel looked up at him from the wagon seat with the direct and completely unfiltered assessment of a 6-year-old. "Is that your horse?" Daniel asked. "That's Abbott," Frederick said seriously, as though this were the most reasonable opening of a conversation. "What's the other one's name?" "George. He's for your mother if she needs to ride out and doesn't want to unhitch the wagon." Daniel looked at George with the expression of someone making a considered evaluation and then looked back at Frederick. "George is a good name for a horse," he said, with the authority of someone who knew these things. "I thought so too," Frederick said. They rode to the house together, and Frederick had opened the shutters and aired the place out the previous day, and there were fresh supplies in the kitchen, flour and coffee and dried beans and salt pork, and a small basket of early tomatoes from someone's garden, the Warrens' garden, she would later learn. The house smelled of open air and grass and coffee, and Daniel ran through it from room to room making the sounds of a child who is making a place his, and Mary stood in the main room and looked at it, Thomas's boots still beside the door, his hat still on the peg, and she breathed. Frederick waited on the porch. She went out to him after a minute. "It's in good order," she said. "I thought you'd want to know what you were coming back to," he said. "Before you came," she looked at him. He was looking out at the land, not at her, the way people sometimes look away when they have said something that matters to them. "Frederick," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and he turned to look at her when she said it quickly, as though the name from her mouth was different from the name from anyone else's. "Yes," he said. "Thank you," she said. "Not just for the land. For all of it." He looked at her for a long moment, then he said, "I'm glad you're here." And that was the beginning. It was not a rushed thing. They were both too old and too practical, and had been through too much for it to be anything but what it was. 2 careful people finding their way toward each other with the same sort of steady determination they both applied to everything else they did. He came by in the morning sometimes early, on the pretense of checking the grazing situation, and stayed for coffee, and then conversation, and then more coffee. And Daniel attached himself to Frederick with the fierce and complete trust of a child who has decided on something, following him around the property asking questions about cattle and fence posts and weather patterns. And Frederick answered every question with seriousness and patience, which Daniel returned in kind by being, in Frederick's presence, slightly less chaotic than he was elsewhere. Mary watched this and felt things she was not yet naming, watching a man who had no obligation to be gentle with her son being gentle with her son without any effort or self-consciousness. In late July, there was a problem with the south fence where a section had come down in a summer storm, and Frederick's cattle, the ones on the eastern section of her land by the grazing agreement, had gotten through onto her neighbor's land to the south, a rancher named Hadley, and there was a minor dispute about it, nothing serious, but it needed sorting. Mary went to the meeting with Hadley herself, riding George, and Frederick came too, not as her representative but as the party whose cattle had done the wandering, and together they had it sorted in an hour with Hadley satisfied, and the fence repaired by end of day. On the ride back with the summer evening long and golden around them, Hadley had said to Frederick before they parted, "You've got good neighbors, Maddox," meaning her, and Frederick had said, "Yes, I know," without elaboration. And Hadley had tipped his hat and ridden away, and Mary and Frederick had continued north along the fence line, and neither of them said anything about what Hadley had said, which was itself a kind of saying something. They were not living the same life yet. She was on her land and he was on his, with the quarter-mile of fence line between them. But the quarter-mile grew shorter in practice, with mornings and evenings and fence-mending afternoons, and Daniel's relentless social calendar around the two neighboring properties, until one evening in August when they were sitting on her porch after supper, which she had cooked, and he had stayed for with no great justification, except that Daniel had asked him to, and he had said yes. And the sun was going down over the plains in the way Kansas sunsets do, in enormous, unembarrassed color. And she said without quite meaning to say it but not quite meaning to say it right then, "I think about you a great deal." He was quiet for a moment. The sun was orange and the grasshoppers were loud in the evening heat. "I think about you considerably more than is reasonable," he said, "given that you live a quarter-mile from me." She laughed, and he turned to look at her when she laughed the same way he had turned the first time in the Caldwell breakfast room, as though the sound was something worth noting. "Mary," he said, her first name, his first time using it, and she felt it land in her chest like the right note of a song. "Yes," she said. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if you're willing. I know that is perhaps the most formal thing anyone has said on this porch in a while, but I would rather be clear about my intentions than have there be any uncertainty." She looked at him. In the orange evening light he looked like something out of the sort of story she had read when she was young and then had decided was not realistic, because real men were not this direct and real life was not this clear. But it was, apparently, sometimes. It was sometimes exactly this clear. "I am willing," she said. He reached over and took her hand, which was lying on the arm of the porch chair, and held it, and they sat like that and watched the sun go down over the plains. And from inside the house came the small sounds of Daniel, who had fallen asleep on the settee an hour ago and was now, faintly, talking in his sleep about horses. The courting was what it was. It was breakfasts and rides and evenings on the porch and long conversations about everything, including the difficult things, about Thomas, about Frederick's years alone on his land, about what Mary wanted her life to be, and what Frederick wanted his to be, and whether those things fit together, which they discovered they did in the ways that mattered and differed in the ways that were interesting rather than incompatible. He told her one evening about the loneliness of the first years in Kansas, the winters particularly, when the wind came down from the north, and the work was hard and relentless, and there was nobody to come home to. He said it plainly, without self-pity, just as a fact of the life he had chosen, and Mary listened and understood it the way she understood the years after Thomas got sick. The particular weight of being the one who keeps the household running while the person you ran it with is ceasing to be the person they were. She told him about Thomas's illness, about the way Thomas had become quieter and harder to reach as he got sicker, and about the fear of watching that happen, and about the particular guilt that accompanied the fear, the worry that she was not doing enough or that she had let herself grieve before he was gone, which had felt like a betrayal. Frederick listened to all of this and said at the end of it quietly, "You didn't fail him. He was ill and you held it together and you kept your son safe, and then you went across 4 days of road to fight for what he had built. That is not the behavior of someone who failed." She had to look away when he said that. In September, 7 months after Thomas's death and 3 months after she had come home, he asked her to marry him. He did not make an elaborate event of it. They were out on the land, the two of them in the early evening, checking the eastern fence where one of the posts had been showing signs of heaving in the soft ground near the creek. He was setting the post straight with a mallet and she was holding the wire, and he stopped what he was doing and turned to her and said, "Mary, will you marry me?" She looked at him. He had a smear of mud on his jaw from where the post had splashed up, and his hat was pushed back on his head, and his eyes were entirely serious and entirely open in that way they had, the way she had come to love about them, that quality of someone who was there fully, without evasion. "Yes," she said. Not immediately, but not slowly, in the right amount of time. He set down the mallet and kissed her, right there by the creek with the evening birds calling and the Kansas grass moving all around them, and it was not a tentative kiss or a polite one. It was the kiss of two people who had been moving toward each other with considerable intention for several months and were glad to arrive. They were married in October of 1882 in the small church in Caldwell, which had been properly completed only the previous year and which still smelled faintly of new lumber under the varnish. Ruth came from Missouri with her husband and 2 of her 3 children, and the Warrens came, and several other neighboring families, and the minister was a young man named Graham who had not been long in Caldwell, but who performed the ceremony with genuine warmth. Daniel stood beside his mother during the ceremony in a new suit that he had been moderately cooperative about wearing, and when the minister asked if anyone had any objection to the marriage, Daniel said, loudly and helpfully, "I don't," which made the entire congregation laugh, including the minister and Frederick, who was standing at the front with his hand about to take Mary's. Turned to look at Daniel with an expression of such complete affection that Mary had to breathe very carefully for a moment to keep from crying. The reception was at the Warren house, which was large enough for the occasion, and there was good food and fiddle music, and the particular warmth of people celebrating something right happening to someone who deserved it. And at the end of the evening, when the stars were out and the night air was cooling, Mary stood in the doorway of the Warren house with her hand in Frederick's and felt, for the first time in over a year, that the weight she had been carrying had been redistributed. She still carried it, would always carry it, the love and the grief and the years with Thomas, the child they had made together, the land they had built together. But it was not on her alone anymore. They moved into the Pritchard house, which became simply the Maddox house in common usage, though both their names were on the deed, and Mary had been clear about that from the first conversation about the arrangement. Frederick's cattle were already grazing the land under the now formal partnership they had drawn up, and the combined operation of the 2 properties was, as Frederick had said flatly and accurately from the first, considerably stronger than either one alone. That winter was a hard one by Kansas standards, with snow in December and a fierce cold spell in January that lasted nearly 3 weeks, and they weathered it in the way that people weather hard winters when they have a solid house and enough wood and enough food and someone to sit beside in the evening. Frederick was up before dawn every day during the cold spell, checking on the cattle, breaking ice on the water troughs, and Mary was up with him, and Daniel was up because Daniel would not be left inside when things were happening outside, and the three of them managed the cold spell together, efficiently and without drama. And on the first morning when the temperature broke and the world was white and still and brilliantly lit by the winter sun, Frederick came in from the barn and stood in the kitchen doorway stamping snow off his boots, and Mary put a cup of coffee in his hand, and he looked at her over the rim and said, "Good morning, Mrs. Maddox," and the name, her name, his name, their name, settled into the morning like something that had always been there. In the spring of 1883, the Attorney General's office in Topeka concluded its investigation of Clarence Whitmore and found sufficient evidence of fraud in multiple property transactions across Sumner County to bring criminal charges. The investigation also resulted in Edmund Hale resigning his position as county commissioner under considerable pressure from the state, and Hale Property Holdings was dissolved. Several other families in the county whose land transactions had been similarly irregular received notifications about their cases, and while not all of them had the documentation that Mary had assembled, 2 other families were able to reclaim property or receive compensation as a result of the broader investigation. Mary received a letter from the Attorney General's office acknowledging her role in initiating the investigation. She read it and handed it to Frederick, and he read it and handed it back, and they looked at each other across the kitchen table. "What do you want to do with it?" he asked. She folded it carefully and put it in the box where she kept the deed and the legal documents. "Nothing," she said. "It's done." He nodded. That spring also brought the first news that Mary was carrying their child, which she told Frederick one morning in March when the world outside was just beginning to green up, the first small, tender green of early Kansas spring. She told him quietly, sitting across the kitchen table, and he went very still for a moment and then reached across the table and took both her hands in his and held them and said nothing at all for a long moment, just held her hands, and she felt his hands around hers, the steadiness of them, the particular warmth, and understood that she was in the right place with the right person, and that the life ahead was wide and open and hers. Daniel's response, when told he was going to have a brother or sister, was to ask a series of clarifying questions about whether the new baby would be useful on horseback, and when and at what age one could reasonably expect a baby to become useful on horseback, and whether it could be a brother because brothers could help with the horses. Mary said they would have to wait and see. Daniel considered this and said that was fair. The summer of 1883 was good. The rains came in the right proportions, and the grass was thick, and the cattle were healthy, and the market at the Caldwell stockyards was strong, and the combined Maddox operation brought in more than either of them had individually projected. Mary kept the accounts with the same organized precision she had always applied to them, and Frederick managed the cattle work with the same steady competence he applied to everything, and together they moved through the days with a rhythm that felt earned rather than easy, which was better than easy. There were evenings on the porch when the sunset was doing its enormous Kansas thing across the western sky, with Frederick in his chair and Mary in hers, and Daniel somewhere in the yard doing something probably inadvisable with a rope. And they would talk about the land, about the plans for the coming season, about Daniel's progress with the reader the Warrens' oldest daughter had been helping him with, about the news from Topeka or the letters from Ruth in Missouri. They talked about Ohio sometimes, Frederick's Ohio, and he told Daniel stories about his own childhood that had the quality of things that had been held quietly for a long time and were only now finding someone to be told to. Daniel called him Papa by August. Not prompted, not encouraged particularly, just one morning at breakfast, addressing some observation about the horses, Daniel said Papa, and both Mary and Frederick went still for just a moment, and then Frederick answered whatever Daniel had asked without making anything of the word, and from that morning on it was simply the word that was used, and the life they were living was simply the life they had. In November of 1883, their son was born. The birth was managed by Mrs. Warren, who had delivered half the children in the county, and it was a hard labor, longer than Mary would have preferred, but Mrs. Warren was steady and competent, and Frederick was in the house the whole time, which was unusual for men of that era, most men waiting outside. But he had said simply and without drama that he intended to be where Mary was, and nobody argued with him. The boy was born in the early morning, just before the November dawn, and he was healthy and loud and had, Mary noted with some private amusement, a jaw that already looked as though it had been cut with deliberate intention. They named him James Thomas Maddox, James for Frederick's grandfather, who had been the one person in the Ohio family who had told Frederick to go west if that's what he needed. Thomas for the man whose land had been the beginning of everything. When Frederick held him for the first time, standing by the bedroom window in the gray pre-dawn light with James Thomas in the crook of his arm, he looked at the baby for a long moment and then looked at Mary, who was exhausted and warm and watching him from the bed, and his face had the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he had not fully known he was heading. "Hello, James," he said quietly to the baby, and the baby made the small, unformed sounds of the very newly born, and Daniel, who had been allowed in now that the alarming parts were over, came and stood on his toes to see and said with great authority, "He's very small. He'll need time." "He will," Frederick agreed. "I'll help," Daniel said. "I know you will," Frederick said. Mary closed her eyes briefly. The room smelled of lamp oil and the November morning coming in at the window, and outside the Kansas plains were going from dark to gray to the first pale light. And in the house, her two boys and her husband were in the same room together, and the land was outside the window where it had always been, hers and theirs, and everything that had been fought for was present and intact. She thought about the morning she had ridden into Caldwell with dust on her wheels and a deed in her pocket and nobody who intended to listen to her. She thought about the committee room and the 12 men who had been waiting for her to run out of words and go away. She thought about a chair scraping on a wooden floor and a voice cutting through the indifference of a room like a clean line through fog. She had come 4 days on a wagon for what was right, and she had gotten what was right, and she had gotten more than she had come for, which was the kind of thing that happened when you moved toward life rather than away from it and refused to let indifference be the final word. When Daniel finally fell asleep on the floor beside the bed, wrapped in the quilt his Aunt Ruth had made for him, and James Thomas was sleeping in the cradle Frederick had built in September, and the November dawn was fully present outside the window, Frederick came and sat beside her on the bed, and she leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the quiet of the morning, their house, their land, their life. "Thank you," she said again, the same words she had said on the porch last summer, but meaning everything different and larger now. He pressed his lips to her hair. "Thank you," he said. Outside, the meadowlarks were starting up, the Kansas morning doing what it always did, enormous and ungoverned and full of light, and the land that had been worth fighting for lay open and green all around them, and the life they had made together on it was exactly what it was, which was everything. The years that followed were full in the way that good years are full, not easy but sufficient, not perfect but deeply right. James Thomas grew from a loud, opinionated infant into a loud, opinionated toddler, and then a child who had his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's particular precision of thought, and who followed Daniel around the property with the complete and worshipful attention of a younger sibling, who believes his older brother to be the most competent person in the world. Daniel, for his part, took the role of older brother with a seriousness that made Frederick genuinely proud, teaching James Thomas to ride before most children his age had gotten comfortable on a horse, and explaining the proper names and purposes of every piece of farming equipment, with the thoroughness of someone who had himself spent years asking questions about these things, and was very glad to pass the information along. Mary taught Daniel to read properly through the winter months, working through the reader with him by lamplight after supper, and by the spring of 1884, He was reading ahead of where the county school in Caldwell would have placed him, which pleased Mary and delighted Daniel primarily because it gave him more access to the almanac, which he found endlessly useful. The Topeka investigation concluded in the autumn of 1884, with Whitmore receiving a 2-year sentence for fraud and the state legislature passing a strengthened provision for co-ownership notification requirements in land transfers, a provision that was directly referenced in the legislative record as responding to documented abuses in Sumner County. Mary read the legislative summary and then put it in the box with the deed and said nothing much about it. But Frederick, reading over her shoulder, put his hand on the back of her neck briefly, and she leaned into it briefly, and that was that. Edmund Hale, having resigned and dissolved his holding company, left the county entirely, and the land he had accumulated through various questionable transactions was broken up over the following years and sold in proper open transactions to various buyers, and the county settled back into the ordinary business of people living on their land and working it. The Warrens remained their closest friends, and in 1885, a new family named the Castles came to the neighboring section to the south after old Hadley retired and his son sold, and the Castles had 4 children and good energy, and a taste for the kind of long evening conversations that the Maddox household also appreciated, and they became part of the fabric of the neighborhood in the way that good neighbors do, not dramatically but thoroughly. By 1886, the Maddox operation covered nearly 500 acres between Mary's original 340 and the additional sections Frederick had held and continued to build, and they ran 200 head of cattle and had a small but productive kitchen garden, and an apple orchard that Frederick had planted from seedlings in their first married spring and which was, by now, beginning to produce in earnest. In the summer of 1886, Mary discovered she was carrying another child. She told Frederick at the breakfast table, the same place she had told him about James Thomas 3 years before, and he responded the same way, going still and then taking her hands, and she laughed at the repetition and he smiled at her laughing and said, "Some responses don't require variation." This time it was a girl. She was born in February of 1887, in a winter that was cold but nothing like the terrible winter of 1886 that had devastated cattle herds across much of the plains. The family had weathered that hard winter well. Between the good management of their grazing and the prudent decisions Frederick had made about herd size in the autumn, and they had come through it without the catastrophic losses that some of their neighbors had suffered, and had quietly helped the Castles through that winter, sharing supplies and labor in the way that neighbors on the plains have always understood is not charity but necessity and decency combined. The girl was born with dark hair and brown eyes that were deeply, specifically Mary's, and she was named Clara Ruth Maddox, Ruth for Mary's sister. And from the first day she was in the house Daniel pronounced her excellent, which was the highest category in his assessment system, and James Thomas, who was 3.5 and at the stage where most things were interesting primarily as objects to investigate, tried to poke her nose within 10 minutes of meeting her, which Frederick redirected with a calmness that came from 3 years of managing James Thomas. Mary sat up in bed the morning after Clara was born, with the February light coming cold and clean through the window, and looked at her daughter and thought about the woman she had been 5 years before, on the wagon road into Caldwell, with the deed in her pocket and nobody willing to listen and nothing guaranteed. She thought about what it had taken, the stubbornness, the documentation, the refusal to be dismissed. She thought about a chair scraping on a wooden floor, and a voice she had not known yet, but would come to know better than nearly any other. She thought about how life does not give things back to you after loss, but sometimes, if you move toward it rather than away, it gives you different things, things that fit the person you have become rather than the person you were, and those things, unexpected and unplanned and harder to see coming than the things you planned for, are sometimes the best things. Frederick came in from the morning chores with cold cheeks and snow on his hat and a cup of coffee for her, and he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Clara and then at Mary, and his expression was the same as it had been in that November dawn 3 years ago, and the same as it had been on the porch the evening she had agreed to be courted, and the same as it had been in the committee room hallway when he said she had not failed Thomas, which was the expression of a man who was exactly where he intended to be. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. Outside, the Kansas plains were white with February snow, and the meadowlarks were somewhere ahead in the coming spring, and the land was solid and present and theirs in every legal and meaningful sense. And in the house, their 3 children were each engaged in their particular versions of existence, and the life they had built together on the land she had refused to surrender was warm and full and continuing. Daniel became the kind of young man Frederick had suspected he would become, competent and opinionated and deeply committed to the land, and when he was old enough to properly work the operation he did so with an investment that was clearly more than obligation. He was interested in the newer agricultural methods being discussed in the farming papers, and he had an ongoing correspondence with a man in Topeka who was experimenting with grain rotation, and he and Frederick had long conversations about these things over supper that Mary sometimes joined and sometimes observed with the particular satisfaction of watching 2 people. She loved arguing about things they both cared deeply about. James Thomas, growing into himself, turned out to have his mother's systematic mind and his father's steadiness, and by the time he was 10, he was keeping his own small records of the weather patterns and the cattle weights, meticulous little notebooks that Mary recognized immediately when she saw them, the same impulse that had led her to make 2 copies of every document by lamplight in a Caldwell rooming house one long night in May of 1882. Clara was her own person entirely, neither her father nor her mother, but something new, with a directness of thought that Frederick recognized and a warmth that was all her own. And she had from early childhood a quality of listening that made people feel heard in a way that was already, at 7 years old, drawing every troubled child in the neighborhood to sit near her. Mary and Frederick grew into the years of their life together the way good things grow, steadily and without fanfare, deepening in the particular way that love between 2 people deepens when they have been through hard things together, and when they have chosen each other not from desperation or convenience, but from the clear-eyed recognition that this person, this specific person, is who you want to be beside. There were ordinary difficult things. A season of low cattle prices, and a year of drought that required careful management and some hard decisions. A winter when Frederick was sick for 6 weeks with something that settled in his chest and scared Mary more than she showed him, and through which she managed the property and the children and the correspondence and the accounts with the same organized competence she applied to everything. And when he was recovered and she finally let herself be frightened, he held her and said, "I'm still here," and she said, "You had better remain so," and he said, "That is my intention." The land of Sumner County changed around them over the years as Kansas filled in, and the frontier period gave way to something more settled. The cattle drives through Caldwell ending in the late 1880s as the railheads moved, and the trails became roads, and the open range gave way to fenced properties. The world changed, and they changed with it, adapting the operation, adding some grain farming alongside the cattle in the later years as the land and the market suggested, and still keeping the accounts and the records in Mary's neat hand, and the fence lines in the good order that Frederick had maintained from the beginning. The view from the center rise of their property, where they had sat and eaten sandwiches on that long-ago spring morning in 1882, remained unchanged in the way that views on the Kansas plains remain unchanged. The horizon still impossibly far and the sky still that particular unself-conscious blue. And they went there sometimes, the 2 of them, on evenings when the work was done and the children were settled, and sat in the grass and looked at it. It was on such an evening in the summer of 1889, with the children's voices drifting up from the direction of the house, and the meadowlarks doing what they always did, and the light going long and golden across the grass, that Frederick said, not for the first time but in the particular way that things that have been true for a long time can still be said as though they are newly discovered, "I am glad you came to Caldwell." Mary leaned against his shoulder. "I am glad you stood up," she said. He put his arm around her, and the sun went down over the Kansas plains in its enormous, daily, entirely reliable way, and the land around them was solid and green and theirs, and everything was exactly as it should be and fully and finally at rest.